Katherine Giles is a lawyer and senior associate from Minter Ellison, who advises New South Wales Catholic schools on privacy issues. She's also contributed to the New South Wales Catholic Schools Privacy Manual for Schools, which can be found on its website.
Katherine, thanks for joining us. Why is privacy important?
Privacy is important for a number of reasons. It's quite a complex question, but if we take it from the international sphere down to our local context, from an international perspective, it's protected as a human right, and that's then balanced with things like the right to freedom of expression. And in Australia, it's protected under various state, territory and federal laws, so in particular the Privacy Act. And it's a recognition that personal information that identifies people is important to that individual for their autonomy, their own identification. It's linked to financial, health, economic and other aspects of their lives. So that's why it's considered to be important.
What do we mean by personal information? What sort of things does that cover?
It's defined in the Act specifically as information that identifies an individual or would tend to identify an individual, and that can either be in material form, so it can be recorded, or it can not be recorded, and it can also include an opinion about someone. And then if we break it down, it's anything from someone's email address to a medical record, their name, their phone number, anything that is personal to that individual. And within that, we've then got sensitive information. So that would be things like religious views, political views, memberships of even a professional organisation or a trade union. And then within that, we've got a subset which is health information. So that's the most obvious. For most people, health information is highly sensitive and highly personal.
Why is it important for Catholic schools to protect the privacy of their staff, their students and even their parents?
Yep, so it's particularly important because schools hold a lot of personal information about individuals, and as you pointed out, it's not just the students who attend, it's the staff, contractors, volunteers who come into the school who might undergo checks before they undertake volunteer opportunities, parents, guardians, then anyone else who is involved with the school. So the school not only has a duty of care towards those people, particularly the students, but they've also got obligations under the Privacy Act to ensure that they protect the personal information of those individuals.
I've seen the privacy manual that's been published for non-government schools. It's over 100 pages long. It's a fairly comprehensive document, isn't it?
It is really comprehensive, but people don't need to be scared of it. The lawyers read it from cover to cover, and often we're involved in writing parts of it. But it really is something that people can dip into. There are sections at the front which summarise things, and then each chapter within the manual addresses each of the Australian privacy principles in the Privacy Act and then how it applies to the school. So like the Office for the Australian Information Commissioner, they also have guidelines as well, and they publish a large guideline that sits alongside the Australian privacy principles. That's also really comprehensive, and like the manual, it provides a lot of examples. So that's why it's really good for people to dip into. They might realise that they've got an issue with transferring information from a foundation that raises funds for the school to a different part of the school, and there'll be a chapter or a section within the manual that'll deal with that, so they can dip into it, have a read, and it'll answer some of their questions.
So they should use it like a reference book, in a sense.
Exactly.
Yeah. What are the Australian privacy principles? What do school leaders need to know about those?
Okay, so the Australian privacy principles we like to call the APPs, just for short, and they're part of the Privacy Act. There's a number of different APPs from 1 to up to 11, and they deal with a lot of different privacy issues. So the collection of personal information, the disclosure of personal information, the use of it, if there are cross-border flows of information, each of those APPs will address different aspects of privacy and how to deal with personal information.
And what sort of risks are there at stake if people's privacy is breached?
Okay, so the OAIC in particular has a number of guidelines that address this, And it is really broad, the risks are broad. So it's not just economic risks. We often think of identity theft and fraud and the economic implications of that, but there are also emotional and psychological risks for people, particularly if it's related to health information. So those are the type of risks for the individual. And then obviously for the entity itself, being in this case the school, there are reputational risks involved. Obviously, if there's a story in the media as a result of a privacy breach, then that's a reputational risk. And then if there's an investigation by the Privacy Commissioner, then there might be other risks associated with that for the school.
What steps do school leaders need to take to ensure privacy breaches are minimised?
Okay, that's a really good question, and it shouldn't be something that schools are worried about. There are a number of guidelines in the manual and steps that are set out, but one of the most important things is having a privacy policy, looking at the types of information that the school is collecting, how they're using it, how they're going to disclose it, and then setting that out in the privacy policy so that the staff understand, and also that's being communicated to the parents and guardians of the children. And then that's the centrepiece for the school in terms of how they deal with personal information. And then from that, there are obviously steps that they can take in terms of training for the staff. And then doing sort of regular audits and looking at the types of personal information that they're holding, where it's stored. If they're using apps or cloud service providers to store information, then they may also want to consider those issues as well.
Whose responsibility is it to have a privacy policy for a school? Because we know that the structure of schools is that sometimes you've got independent Catholic schools and other times you've got schools that belong to a diocese, a much larger organisation.
It'll be the entity that's collecting the information that has that responsibility. So as you pointed out, in some cases that will be the diocese, because there will be a group of schools that are part of that diocese and they will have a privacy policy for that group. And then independent Catholic schools will have their own particular privacy policy that might sit on their website, for example, and that's how people access it. But really it's about looking at the information flows. So as lawyers, we like to sit down with a piece of paper and draw a diagram and say, this is where the personal information is being collected, and this is where it's going to and being stored, and this is how it's being used.
What should a school do in the event of a privacy breach? Because sometimes these can be accidental rather than someone trying to sort of break into the school through its firewalls. There can be inadvertent breaches. What should they do if one of those occurs?
Yep, there's a couple of different aspects to that question, which is what makes privacy so interesting. So you might have a privacy breach which is accidentally a letter is sent to the incorrect household, and it might have some personal information in it, some medical or sensitive information, and that in itself might be a privacy breach. You've also got a school who doesn't, for example, have a privacy policy. That would be a breach of the Privacy Act as well. And then you've got the larger breaches, which we sort of see in the media, where someone's hacked into a system and accessed a database that contains personal information or sensitive health information. So they're the type of sort of privacy breaches that you're dealing with. If any of those occur, then the school should assess the situation and work out what steps they need to take and get some advice in relation to it. We also have the mandatory data breach notification scheme, which is coming into effect in February next year. So if there is an eligible data breach, once that scheme is in place, then schools will have an obligation to notify the Privacy Commissioner, and there is a procedure that's set out for that. They'll need to assess the breach to work out whether it's eligible, and then to work out whether they need to notify the Privacy Commissioner. And there's a lot of guidelines on the website about that, which are also quite helpful.
Finally, what rights do parents have if they feel their privacy has been breached? Is there somewhere they can complain?
Okay, so if a parent feels that their privacy or their child's privacy has been breached, the first step would be to take a look at the privacy policy for the school or the diocese where their child attends school, because in that privacy policy, if it's compliant with the APPs and the Privacy Act, there will be a section that deals with complaints, and there will be an email or a phone number or a person that they can contact, or they may contact the school. So the first step would be to try and work it out with the school. If they don't feel like their complaint has been heard or it hasn't been dealt with appropriately, then they can go to the Privacy Commissioner and lodge a complaint there. The Privacy Commissioner will then try and mediate the situation and see if it can be resolved. If that's not possible, then it is possible for the Privacy Commissioner to seek a declaration or orders, and there are penalties as well that apply. But that's generally the timeline of how things would progress. But start with the school, see if it can be worked out, look at the privacy policy.
Katherine Giles, a lawyer with Minter Ellison. Let's review the key points she made regarding the Privacy Act. Privacy is important because it is linked to a person's health, financial, economic and other personal aspects of their lives. Schools collect and store personal information and therefore have an obligation to ensure it is safeguarded. The Privacy Manual for non-government schools should be read as a reference guide. The Australian Privacy Principles govern the collection and disclosure of personal information. As we heard in the interview with Katherine, from February 2018, it is mandatory to report data breaches if the breach is likely to result in serious harm to any of the individuals whose personal information has been accessed. Obviously, your school's priority is to ensure that data breaches do not occur. If, however, a data breach has occurred, you will need to determine if the breach is notifiable, and if so, what notification steps you need to take. You should ask 3 questions to decide whether a data breach is notifiable. Has there been an unauthorised access, loss or disclosure of personal information? Is the data breach likely to result in serious harm to one or more individuals? Are you unable to prevent the likely risk of serious harm with remedial action? If the answer to all 3 questions is yes, then the matter is a notifiable data breach and you will need to notify the affected individuals and the Office of the Australian Information Commissioner. It may also be relevant to notify other persons or organisations such as police if a crime has been committed, and the Australian Taxation Office if, for example, tax file numbers have been accessed.